Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The winter of 1914 descended upon the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Tennessee with a particular cruelty that old-timers would remember for decades to come. Snow accumulated in drifts that reached past the windows of the weathered wooden cabins dotting the steep hillsides, and the wind howled through the bare branches of oak and hickory trees with a mournful sound that seemed to carry warnings from the past. In the small coal mining community of Blackstone Hollow, where the company owned everything from the houses to the general store, life moved to the rhythm of the mine whistle that signaled shift changes and the occasional tragedy that befell men working hundreds of feet below the frozen earth. Clara Elizabeth Ward had just celebrated her 21st birthday in the modest two-room cabin her family rented from the Consolidated Coal Company. She was the eldest daughter of Thomas Ward, a coal miner whose lungs had begun to fail him after 18 years underground, and Margaret Ward, a washerwoman who took in laundry from the mine superintendent's family and the few merchants who could afford such services. Clara possessed a striking beauty that seemed out of place in the harsh mountain environment, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, green eyes that reflected the color of the spruce trees covering the higher elevations, and skin that remained remarkably fair despite the coal dust that seemed to settle on everything in Blackstone Hollow. Her hands, however, told the truth of her existence, roughened by years of helping her mother with the washing, by tending the small garden that provided vegetables during the short growing season, and by caring for her three younger siblings. The Ward family occupied a position in the rigid social hierarchy of Blackstone Hollow that was neither at the top nor the bottom, but somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Thomas Ward was a skilled miner, respected by his fellow workers for his knowledge of the coal seams and his willingness to speak up when safety conditions deteriorated, which they frequently did under the company's relentless pressure to increase production. This respect, however, came with a price. The mine supervisors and the company bosses viewed Thomas Ward with suspicion, seeing in him a potential troublemaker who might encourage other miners to demand better wages or safer working conditions. Margaret Ward's position as a washerwoman for the superintendent's family provided the Wards with a small measure of protection and a few extra dollars each month, but it also placed them in an awkward position between the working families and those who held power over their lives. Clara had received more education than most girls in Blackstone Hollow, attending the company school until she was 15, where she learned to read and write with a proficiency that surprised even the schoolteacher. A stern woman from Knoxville who had come to the mountains with missionary zeal to civilize what she considered backward people. Clara read everything she could find, borrowing books from the small lending library the teacher maintained in the schoolhouse, devouring novels by Charles Dickens and poetry by Longfellow and Tennyson. She dreamed of a life beyond the coal-blackened hollow, imagining herself in places she had only read about, cities with electric lights and paved streets, concert halls where orchestras played symphonies, universities where young women could study literature and philosophy. These dreams seemed as distant and unattainable as the stars that appeared on rare clear nights above the mountain ridges. The reality of Clara's daily existence was far removed from her dreams. Each morning before dawn, she rose to help her mother prepare breakfast for her father and brothers before they headed to the mine. The cabin was perpetually cold during the winter months despite the fire that burned constantly in the iron stove, and Clara had learned to dress quickly in the darkness, pulling on layers of worn clothing that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. After the men left for work, Clara and her mother would begin the exhausting labor of washing clothes, heating water in large kettles over the fire, scrubbing collars and cuffs on washboards until their knuckles were raw, hanging the wet garments on lines strung across the cabin where they would steam and drip throughout the day. In the afternoon, Clara would help care for her younger siblings, teaching them their letters and numbers, reading to them from the few books she owned, trying to pass on to them some spark of the education she had received out on Sundays. The Ward family attended services at the Blackstone Hollow Methodist Church, a simple wooden structure that served as the community's primary gathering place. The preacher, Reverend Josiah Thompson, delivered sermons that emphasized endurance, obedience, and the rewards that awaited the faithful in the afterlife, messages that provided comfort to people whose present lives offered little joy. Clara sat in the hard wooden pew between her mother and her sister, singing hymns in a clear soprano voice that drew appreciative glances from other churchgoers, and listening to the Reverend's words with a mixture of belief and doubt. She wanted to believe that suffering in this world would be compensated in the next, but part of her mind rebelled against the idea that people should simply accept their circumstances without trying to change them. The social dynamics of Blackstone Hollow were complex and carefully maintained. The mine superintendent, Charles Thornton, and his family lived in a large house on the hill overlooking the hollow, a house with glass windows, painted siding, and a front porch that spoke of comfort and permanence. Below them in the social order came the mine foreman, the company clerk, the doctor who served the company's interests more than the miners' health, and the few merchants who operated businesses in the company town. The miners and their families occupied the bottom tier, living in identical company-owned cabins, buying their necessities from the company store on credit that kept them perpetually in debt, their lives controlled by the company from cradle to grave. Within this bottom tier, however, there were subtle distinctions. Families like the Wards, who maintained standards of cleanliness and respectability, who sent their children to school regularly, who attended church faithfully, occupied a slightly higher position than those families who succumbed to despair and alcohol, whose children ran wild through the hollow, whose cabins were chaotic and filthy. Clara became acutely aware of these social distinctions as she entered her late teenage years, and young men from the mining families began to express interest in courting her. There was Billy Patterson, whose father worked alongside Thomas Ward in the mine, a good-natured young man with limited intelligence and fewer prospects who would almost certainly follow his father into the mine and die young of lung disease or in a cave-in. There was Samuel Morrison, slightly older and more ambitious, who had managed to secure a position as a clerk in the company store, a job that kept him above ground and provided slightly better wages, but who carried himself with an air of superiority that Clara found distasteful. These young men and others like them represented the full range of possibilities that Blackstone Hollow offered to a young woman of Clara's station. She could marry one of them, bear his children, wash his clothes, cook his meals, and watch herself age prematurely like her mother and every other woman in the hollow, or she could remain unmarried and become increasingly invisible as younger girls caught the attention of available men. Margaret Ward worried constantly about Clara's future. She recognized her daughter's intelligence and sensitivity, qualities that seemed both a blessing and a curse in their circumstances. Margaret had married at 17, had borne her first child at 18, and had spent the following 20 years in a cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing that had worn down her body and spirit. She wanted something better for Clara, but she could not imagine what that something might be. When Margaret tried to talk to her daughter about the importance of finding a suitable husband, Clara would listen politely and then change the subject, unwilling to discuss a future that filled her with dread. Margaret sensed that Clara was waiting for something, though neither of them could articulate what that something was. The event that would change Clara's life forever occurred on a cold February afternoon when the Ward family's precarious position in the community's social structure was suddenly elevated by an unexpected opportunity. Mrs. Thornton, the mine superintendent's wife, informed Margaret Ward that she was looking for a young woman to serve as a companion and assistant to her elderly mother, who had recently come to live with the Thornton family. The position would require someone who could read aloud, write letters, provide pleasant conversation, and assist with personal care. The position would pay $3 a week, a substantial sum for a young woman in Blackstone Hollow, and would include one meal a day taken in the Thornton kitchen. Mrs. Thornton had observed Clara at church and during the times when Margaret delivered clean laundry to the Thornton house, and she believed that Clara possessed the refinement and education necessary for the position. Margaret Ward was overwhelmed with gratitude and trepidation. The opportunity was extraordinary, lifting Clara above the other young women in the hollow and providing income that would significantly help the family. However, Margaret also understood that accepting the position would place Clara in close proximity to people far above their station, exposing her to a world of comfort and privilege that would make her own circumstances seem even more unbearable. Thomas Ward, when informed of the offer, saw it primarily in practical terms as additional income that would help offset his declining productivity at the mine as his health deteriorated. Clara's response to the news was more complicated. She felt excitement at the prospect of escaping the drudgery of washing clothes and the possibility of access to books and conversation, But she also felt anxiety about entering the Thornton household and navigating the complex social expectations that would come with the position. Clara began her new position on the first Monday in March, walking up the hill to the Thornton house in the early morning light, wearing her best dress that her mother had carefully washed and pressed for the occasion. The Thornton house seemed enormous to Clara, with its multiple rooms, upholstered furniture, carpeted floors, and walls lined with books. Mrs. Thornton greeted Clara with a mixture of kindness and condescension, explaining that Clara should enter through the back door, take her meals in the kitchen rather than the dining room, and maintain appropriate boundaries with the family members. Clara was then introduced to Mrs. Sarah Caldwell, Mrs. Thornton's mother, a woman of 72 years who had been a teacher before her marriage and who still possessed a sharp mind despite her physical frailty. Mrs. Caldwell took an immediate liking to Clara, appreciating her intelligence and the careful way she spoke, evidence of her education and her efforts to improve herself. The old woman asked Clara about the books she had read, engaged her in discussions about poetry and literature, and shared her own experiences growing up in Nashville before the Civil War, when life in Tennessee had been very different. Clara found herself looking forward to her days at the Thornton house, not because of the comfortable surroundings but because of the stimulating conversations with Mrs. Caldwell, who treated her not as a servant but as a companion. Mrs. Caldwell began lending Clara books from her personal collection, volumes of poetry, novels by Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, books of history and philosophy that opened up new worlds of thought and possibility. As winter gave way to early spring, Clara settled into a routine that divided her days between the Thornton house and her family's cabin. The contrast between the two worlds became increasingly stark. At the Thornton house, she inhabited a realm of order, cleanliness, intellectual stimulation, and material comfort. In her family's cabin, she returned to a world of constant labor, cramped quarters, and the pervasive smell of coal dust and poverty. This daily crossing between two different worlds began to change Clara in subtle ways. She became more aware of the injustices inherent in a system where some people lived in comfort because others lived in deprivation, where children died of preventable diseases because the company would not pay for adequate medical care, where men destroyed their bodies in the mines so that distant shareholders could profit. She also became more aware of her own desires for education, for beauty, for experiences beyond the narrow confines of Blackstone Hollow. It was during this period of transition and awakening that Clara first encountered the person who would become central to her story. The Thornton family had hired a new physician to replace the aging Dr. Morrison, who served primarily as the company doctor but who also maintained a small private practice treating those who could afford his fees. The new doctor was named James Whitfield, a man of 35 years who had completed his medical training at Vanderbilt University in Nashville before spending several years working in a hospital in Memphis. Dr. Whitfield had come to Blackstone Hollow for reasons that were not immediately clear to the residents, as most educated professionals viewed the coal mining communities of eastern Tennessee as places to escape from rather than destinations to seek out Dr. Whitfield was tall and lean, with dark hair beginning to show traces of gray at the temples, brown eyes that observed the world with unusual intensity, and a serious demeanor that suggested a man who had experienced significant sorrow. He moved into a small house near the company office, set up his medical practice in 2 rooms, and began treating both company-related injuries and private patients. What set Dr. Whitfield apart from Dr. Morrison and other company doctors Clara had observed was his genuine concern for his patients' welfare and his willingness to criticize the company when working conditions compromised miners' health. Within weeks of his arrival, Dr. Whitfield had earned the respect of the mining families by treating their children for free when they could not pay, by making house calls at all hours regardless of the weather, and by speaking directly to mine supervisors about safety violations that endangered workers. Clara first met Dr. Whitfield when Mrs. Caldwell developed a severe respiratory infection that left her weak and feverish. Mrs. Thornton summoned Dr. Whitfield to the house, and Clara was present in Mrs. Caldwell's room when he arrived to examine his patient. Clara noticed immediately how gentle and patient he was with the elderly woman, explaining his findings in terms she could understand, offering realistic assessments of her condition without false optimism or unnecessary alarm. After examining Mrs. Caldwell and prescribing medication, Dr. Whitfield spoke briefly with Clara, asking about Mrs. Caldwell's daily routine, her diet, her sleeping patterns, information that would help him provide better care. He spoke to Clara with the same respect he had shown Mrs. Caldwell, looking directly at her, listening carefully to her responses, treating her as someone whose observations and intelligence were valuable. Over the following weeks, as Mrs. Caldwell slowly recovered from her illness, Dr. Whitfield made several visits to the Thornton house to check on his patient's progress. During these visits, he often found Clara reading aloud to Mrs. Caldwell or helping her with correspondence, and he began to linger after completing his medical duties, joining in conversations about literature and current events. Clara discovered that Dr. Whitfield was remarkably well-read, that he had traveled to cities she had only imagined, that he held progressive views about social reform and workers' rights that were rare among educated professionals. She found herself looking forward to his visits, preparing questions to ask him, hoping that he would stay longer to talk. Dr. Whitfield, for his part, seemed equally drawn to Clara, impressed by her intelligence and curious about her thoughts and opinions. The spring of 1914 brought changes to Blackstone Hollow beyond the warming weather and to the appearance of wildflowers on the mountain slopes. Tensions between the miners and the company management had been increasing for months, fueled by a recent reduction in wages, deteriorating safety conditions, and the company's refusal to address miners' grievances. Thomas Ward had become more outspoken about these issues, attending meetings where miners discussed the possibility of forming a union, a word that the company officials treated as synonymous with rebellion and violence. Margaret Ward begged her husband to be careful, to think about his family and the consequences of antagonizing the company, but Thomas Ward felt he had a responsibility to stand up for his fellow workers, especially as his own declining health made him less vulnerable to threats of termination. Clara became aware of these tensions through conversations she overheard at the Thornton house and through her father's increasingly animated discussions at home about miners' rights and social justice. She felt torn between her loyalty to her family and her position in the Thornton household, understanding that her employment depended on maintaining good relations with the family that represented the company's interests. Dr. Whitfield, during one of his visits to check on Mrs. Caldwell, spoke with Clara about the situation, expressing his concern that conflict was inevitable if the company continued to ignore legitimate complaints about wages and working conditions. He told Clara that he had examined dozens of miners suffering from lung diseases caused by inadequate ventilation in the mines, that he had treated children weakened by malnutrition because their families could not afford adequate food on the wages their fathers earned, that he had witnessed entirely preventable deaths because the company prioritized profit over safety. His words resonated with Clara's own observations and awakened in her a sense of moral outrage that she had previously suppressed. As their conversations became more frequent and more personal, Clara and Dr. Whitfield began to develop a connection that transcended their different social positions. He shared with her the story of his own past, how he had grown up in a prosperous family in Nashville, how he had lost his young wife to typhoid fever 3 years after their marriage, how his grief had driven him to seek meaning through serving people who genuinely needed medical care rather than pursuing wealth and status in an urban practice. Clara listened with sympathy and recognition, understanding that his sorrows had shaped him just as her circumstances had shaped her. She shared with him her dreams of education and her frustrations with a life that offered so few opportunities for growth and change. They discovered that despite the differences in their backgrounds and education, they shared fundamental values about human dignity, social justice, and the importance of compassion. The realization that she had fallen in love with Dr. Whitfield came to Clara gradually and then all at once during an afternoon in late April when spring had fully arrived in the mountains. She had been reading to Mrs. Caldwell from a volume of Wordsworth's poetry, and Dr. Whitfield had stopped by to check on his patient's recovery. After his examination, Mrs. Caldwell had fallen asleep in her chair, and Clara and Dr. Whitfield had stood by the window overlooking the valley, discussing the poems Clara had been reading. He had quoted lines from memory, and she had responded with her own favorite passages, and suddenly they were standing very close to each other, and the air between them seemed charged with an energy that was both frightening and exhilarating. Dr. Whitfield had looked at Clara with an expression that revealed his own feelings, and in that moment, Clara understood that he loved her as she loved him, and that this love represented both the fulfillment of her dreams and the beginning of an impossible situation. The awareness of their mutual feelings created a new and complicated dynamic between Clara and Dr. Whitfield that they both struggled to navigate in the weeks that followed. They maintained the appearance of propriety during his visits to the Thornton house, never touching, always maintaining appropriate physical distance, their conversations carefully controlled when others might overhear. But the looks that passed between them, the careful way they avoided brushing against each other, the heightened awareness of each other's presence in the room, all communicated what words could not express. Mrs. Caldwell, despite her age and physical frailty, possessed the keen perception of someone who had lived long enough to recognize love in its various forms, and she watched the interaction between Clara and Dr. Whitfield with a mixture of concern and sympathy. Dr. Whitfield began finding reasons to visit the Thornton house more frequently than Mrs. Caldwell's health strictly required, checking on his patient but clearly seeking opportunities to see Clara. He would time his visits to coincide with the hours when Clara was reading to Mrs. Caldwell, and he would remain longer than necessary, joining their conversations about books and ideas. Clara found herself dressing with more care on the days she expected his visits, borrowing ribbons from her sister to tie in her hair, pinching her cheeks to bring color to them, feeling both foolish and hopeful about these small vanities. She lived for the moments when she could be in his presence, when she could listen to his voice and watch the expressions that crossed his face, when she could share her thoughts and know that he valued what she said. The impossibility of their situation became increasingly clear to both of them as spring advanced towards summer. The social gulf that separated a companion to an elderly woman, the daughter of a coal miner, from a university-educated physician was vast and unbridgeable in the rigid hierarchies of Tennessee mountain society in 1914. It was not merely a matter of education or income, though those differences were significant. It was a matter of fundamental social categories that defined who people were and what relationships were permissible. Dr. Whitfield might treat Clara with respect, might engage her in intellectual conversation, might even recognize her as his equal in intelligence and moral character, but to court her openly, to consider marrying her, would violate social boundaries that were enforced not by law but by something more powerful, the collective judgment of the community. Clara understood these realities with painful clarity. She had observed how the residents of Blackstone Hollow talked about those who violated social norms, the harsh judgments rendered against women who became pregnant out of wedlock, against men who failed to support their families, against anyone who challenged the established order. She knew that if her relationship with Dr. Whitfield became known, she would be seen as a scheming woman trying to elevate herself above her station, possibly even as a woman of loose morals who had tried to seduce a respectable man. Dr. Whitfield would be seen as having compromised his professional standing by becoming involved with someone so far beneath him socially, and his reputation in the community would suffer. The Thornton family would certainly terminate her employment, viewing any romantic connection between their elderly mother's companion and a physician they had brought to the community as a betrayal of trust. Despite understanding all of this, Clara could not stop herself from loving Dr. Whitfield, could not prevent herself from looking forward to seeing him, could not suppress the hope that somehow circumstances might change to allow them to be together. Dr. Whitfield appeared to be experiencing similar internal conflicts. During one visit in early May, when Mrs. Caldwell had gone to rest in another room, he spoke to Clara with unusual directness about his feelings. He told her that he had not expected to feel love again after his wife's death, that he had believed that part of his life was finished, that meeting Clara had awakened emotions he thought were dead. He told her that he admired her intelligence, her strength, her kindness, her determination to improve herself despite the obstacles in her path. He told her that she was the most remarkable woman he had ever known, and that if circumstances were different, if they lived in a different place or time, he would court her openly and ask her to marry him. Clara listened to these words with tears streaming down her face, knowing that they were both a gift and a curse. The gift was in knowing that he loved her as she loved him, that her feelings were not foolish or one-sided, that what she experienced was real and shared. The curse was in knowing that these feelings could not lead anywhere, that their love existed in a realm of impossibility, that expressing it openly would bring catastrophe to both of them. She told him that she loved him as well, words that she had never expected to speak to any man, certainly not to someone like him. They stood facing each other in Mrs. Caldwell's sitting room, close enough to touch but not touching, and the space between them seemed to contain all the longing and frustration and impossibility of their situation. From that day forward, Clara and Dr. Whitfield existed in a state of emotional tension that colored every interaction. They continued to maintain strict propriety in their outward behavior, never giving anyone reason to suspect that their relationship was anything other than casual acquaintance facilitated by their mutual care for Mrs. Caldwell. But privately, during stolen moments when they could speak without being overheard, they shared their thoughts and feelings with an intimacy that was all the more powerful for being restrained. They talked about their dreams for the future, about the kind of world they wished existed, about books they had read and ideas they had encountered. They created a private world of conversation and connection that existed parallel to the public world where such a relationship was forbidden. Mrs. Caldwell, who missed little despite her age and illness, called Clara to her bedside one afternoon in late May and spoke to her with the directness of someone who had lived long enough to see past social conventions to human realities. She told Clara that she had observed the connection between her and Dr. Whitfield, that she recognized it as genuine affection and not merely infatuation. She told Clara that she understood the difficulties such a relationship would face in their community, but she also told Clara that love was rare and precious, and that people sometimes had to make difficult choices about whether to pursue happiness or to conform to social expectations. Mrs. Caldwell did not offer specific advice or encourage Clara to act in any particular way, but she made it clear that she would not judge Clara harshly regardless of what choices she made, and that Clara would have her support should she need it. This conversation with Mrs. Caldwell both comforted and troubled Clara. It comforted her to know that at least one person understood her situation and did not condemn her for her feelings. It troubled her because it forced her to think seriously about what she wanted and what she was willing to risk to pursue it. Clara spent long hours walking alone through the woods above Blackstone Hollow during her free time, thinking about her life and her choices. She thought about the future that awaited her if she simply accepted her circumstances. Marriage to someone like Billy Patterson or Samuel Morrison, a life of hard work and limited horizons, children who would grow up in the same poverty and limitation that had defined her own childhood. She thought about her love for Dr. Whitfield and what it would mean to act on that love, knowing that doing so would violate every social norm she had been taught to respect, would bring shame to her family, would likely destroy Dr. Whitfield's standing in the community. The situation in Blackstone Hollow grew increasingly tense as summer approached. The miners had begun organizing meetings to discuss forming a union, meetings that the company officials viewed with alarm and hostility. Charles Thornton, the mine superintendent, issued warnings that any miner who joined a union would be immediately terminated and evicted from company housing. Thomas Ward, despite his deteriorating health and his family's dependence on company goodwill, continued to attend organizing meetings and to speak in favor of workers' rights. The divide between the mining families and the company officials widened, transforming Blackstone Hollow into a community on the verge of open conflict. Clara found herself caught in the middle of this conflict, her position in the Thornton household making her an object of suspicion among some of the miners' families who saw her as having aligned herself with the owners against the workers. Dr. Whitfield became increasingly involved in the miners' cause, using his position as a physician to document the health problems caused by poor working conditions, writing letters to state health officials calling for inspections of the mines, treating injured miners without charge. His actions earned him the gratitude of the mining families and the hostility of the company officials, who saw him as a traitor to his class and a troublemaker who should never have been hired. Charles Thornton summoned Dr. Whitfield to his office and warned him that his contract with the company could be terminated if he continued to undermine company interests. Dr. Whitfield responded that his primary obligation was to his patient's health, not to the company's profits, and that he would not compromise his medical ethics to serve corporate interests. This confrontation, which became widely known throughout Blackstone Hollow, further polarized the community and raised Dr. Whitfield's standing among the workers. For Clara, Dr. Whitfield's increasing involvement in the miners' cause created complicated emotions. She admired his courage and his commitment to justice, seeing in his actions a moral integrity that made her love him even more deeply. But she also feared for his safety and his future, knowing that the company had extensive power and would not tolerate opposition indefinitely. She worried that his defiance of the company would lead to his dismissal, forcing him to leave Blackstone Hollow and ending any possibility that they might be together. At the same time, she felt guilty about her own relatively privileged position in the Thornton household, wondering if by accepting employment from the company she was complicit in the exploitation of her father and the other minors. These conflicting feelings came to a head one evening in mid-June when Clara was walking home from the Thornton house just before sunset. Dr. Whitfield, who had been making calls to miners' families in the Hollow, encountered her on the path. They stopped to speak, and Dr. Whitfield, perhaps emboldened by the intensity of the recent events or by the beauty of the evening light filtering through the trees, told Clara that he could no longer pretend that his feelings for her were casual or controllable. He told her that he wanted to find a way for them to be together, that he was willing to face the consequences of violating social conventions, that he believed their love was worth fighting for. He asked her if she felt the same way, if she was willing to pursue a relationship despite the obstacles they would face. Clara's response was shaped by weeks of internal struggle and by a growing sense that her life required more courage than she had previously shown. She told Dr. Whitfield that she loved him and that she wanted to be with him, but that she needed time to think about what that would mean for her family and for both of their futures. She told him that she was afraid of the consequences but also afraid of living a life without taking risks for the things that mattered most. They agreed to continue their conversations in private, to explore the possibility of a relationship while being mindful of the need for discretion, at least until they could determine a path forward that would minimize harm to others. Over the following weeks, Clara and Dr. Whitfield began meeting secretly, careful to avoid detection by choosing locations and times that would not attract attention. They would meet in the woods above the Hollow after Clara finished her work at the Thornton house, or they would arrange brief encounters when Dr. Whitfield was making calls to patients who lived near the Ward family cabin. These meetings were innocent in their physical expression, involving nothing more than conversation and occasionally holding hands, but they represented a profound violation of social norms and a risk that could ruin both of their lives if discovered. They talked about practical questions like where they might go if they left Blackstone Hollow, whether Dr. Whitfield could establish a practice in a more progressive community where their relationship would face less opposition, how they might navigate the complex logistics of building a life together. These conversations revealed both the depth of their feelings and the practical difficulties they would face. Dr. Whitfield had debts from his medical education that he was still repaying, making it difficult for him to relocate without substantial savings. Clara had responsibilities to her family, particularly as her father's health continued to decline and her mother depended on the income Clara provided from her position in the Thornton household. They both recognized that leaving Blackstone Hollow would mean abandoning people who needed them, the elderly Mrs. Caldwell in Dr. Whitfield's case, Clara's family in her case. Yet they also recognized that staying in Blackstone Hollow while pursuing their relationship would eventually lead to discovery and scandal, with consequences that would extend far beyond themselves to affect their families and the communities they served. The decision of what to do was complicated further by an unexpected development in late June. Thomas Ward was injured in a mine accident when a support timber collapsed, crushing his leg and keeping him from work for several weeks. The injury was serious enough to require ongoing medical care that Dr. Whitfield provided without charge, visiting the Ward cabin daily to change dressings and check for signs of infection. These visits gave Dr. Whitfield and Clara opportunities to see each other more frequently, though always under circumstances that required them to maintain strict propriety in the presence of Clara's family. Margaret Ward was grateful for Dr. Whitfield's care and his refusal to charge for his services, but she was also perceptive enough to notice the way he looked at Clara and the way Clara responded to his presence. She said nothing, but Clara could feel her mother's watchful concern. Thomas Ward's injury had severe financial consequences for the family. Without his wages, even though they were reduced due to his declining health, the family struggled to pay for food and other necessities. The company store extended credit, but at high interest rates that increased the family's debt. Clara's wages from her position with Mrs. Caldwell became even more critical to the family's survival, making the risk of losing that position through scandal even more terrifying. Dr. Whitfield tried to help by providing small amounts of money disguised as payment for Clara's assistance with his medical work, a fiction that both of them knew was transparent but that preserved some degree of dignity. The stress of her father's injury and the family's financial crisis weighed heavily on Clara. adding to the emotional burden she already carried regarding her relationship with Dr. Whitfield. In early July, the tensions in Blackstone Hollow exploded into open conflict when the miners went on strike after the company announced another wage reduction. The strike was organized by workers who had been secretly meeting to discuss unionization, and Thomas Ward, despite his injury, was among the leaders advocating for the strike. The company responded with predictable harshness, bringing in armed guards to protect the mine and threatening strikers with eviction from company housing. The community divided sharply between those who supported the strike and those who feared the consequences of defying the company. Dr. Whitfield openly supported the strikers, providing medical care to their families and speaking at meetings about the health hazards of the current working conditions. His support for the strike further alienated him from the company officials and made his position in Blackstone Hollow increasingly precarious. Clara found herself in an impossible position. Her father was one of the strike leaders, making her family a target of company retaliation. Her employment in the Thornton household, working for the family of the mine superintendent, made her suspect among some of the striking miners' families. Her relationship with Dr. Whitfield, though still secret, complicated everything further. She continued to go to the Thornton house each day, caring for Mrs. Caldwell and trying to ignore the hostile atmosphere that pervaded the household as Charles Thornton fumed about the ungrateful workers who were disrupting mine operations. Mrs. Caldwell provided what comfort she could, speaking kindly to Clara and assuring her that none of the current troubles were her fault, but even Mrs. Caldwell's kindness could not alleviate the stress of Clara's situation. The strike lasted 3 weeks before collapsing under the combined pressure of company threats, financial desperation, and the inability of the workers to sustain their action without outside support. The miners returned to work under the same conditions that had prompted the strike, but with the additional burden of company resentment and suspicion. Several miners who had been identified as strike leaders, including Thomas Ward, were terminated and evicted from their company houses. The Ward family was given 1 week to vacate their cabin, a devastating blow that left them facing homelessness as Thomas Ward recovered from his injury and had no prospects for employment. The company's retaliation sent a clear message to other workers about the consequences of challenging corporate power. The eviction notice that arrived at the Ward family cabin on a sweltering August morning represented not just the loss of shelter but the complete collapse of the fragile stability they had maintained. Thomas Ward sat in silence after reading the notice, his injured leg propped on a chair, his face reflecting the defeat of a man who had fought for principles and lost everything. Margaret Ward wept quietly as she began to pack their few possessions, knowing that they had nowhere to go and no resources to establish a new home. Clara's younger siblings, frightened by the sudden crisis and by their parents' distress, clung to their mother and asked questions that had no good answers. Clara herself felt a crushing sense of responsibility, knowing that her father's involvement in the strike had led to this catastrophe and wondering if there was anything she could have done to prevent it. Dr. Whitfield learned of the Ward family's eviction the same day and immediately came to their cabin to offer assistance. He told Thomas Ward that he knew of a family who rented rooms in a house several miles from Blackstone Hollow, outside of company control, where the Wards could stay temporarily until Thomas Ward recovered sufficiently to seek employment elsewhere. He offered to pay the first month's rent and to provide additional financial assistance until the family could get back on their feet. Thomas Ward initially refused, his pride rebelling against accepting what felt like charity, but Margaret Ward convinced him that their children's welfare had to take priority over pride. Dr. Whitfield also told Thomas Ward that he was documenting the working conditions in the coal mines and the company's retaliation against workers who advocated for improvements, information he planned to share with state labor officials and newspaper reporters who might publicize the situation. The week before the Ward family's forced departure from Blackstone Hollow was marked by frantic activity and deep emotional turmoil. Clara continued to work at the Thornton house during the day, caring for Mrs. Caldwell while trying to ignore the satisfied comments from Mrs. Thornton about the troublemakers finally getting what they deserved. In the evenings, Clara helped her mother pack their belongings and tried to comfort her siblings, telling them stories and singing songs to distract them from their fear. She felt increasingly angry at the injustice of their situation, at a system that allowed people to be thrown out of their homes for demanding fair treatment, at the callousness of those who had power and used it to punish the vulnerable. This anger was complicated by her guilt about her relationship with Dr. Whitfield, which represented a personal happiness that seemed selfish and inappropriate given her family's suffering. Dr. Whitfield arranged for a wagon to transport the Ward family and their possessions to their new temporary lodging, and he helped load their furniture and boxes on the appointed day. Charles Thornton watched from his house on the hill as the Ward family left Blackstone Hollow, a visible warning to other miners about the consequences of defiance. Clara rode in the wagon with her family, watching the only home she had known recede into the distance, feeling both grief for what was lost and relief at escaping the oppressive atmosphere of the company town. The house where they would be staying was small and crowded, but it was clean and the family who owned it was kind, making space for the Wards and treating them with sympathy rather than judgment. The new living situation created complications for Clara's position with Mrs. Caldwell. The house was 6 miles from the Thornton home, too far to walk daily, especially as August heat made the mountain roads nearly unbearable during midday hours. Mrs. Thornton suggested that Clara's employment should be terminated given the changed circumstances, but Mrs. Caldwell insisted that Clara remain as her companion, arguing that Clara's presence was essential to her well-being and that arrangements could be made for Clara to stay at the Thornton house several days each week. Mrs. Caldwell offered to pay for Clara's room and board on the days she stayed at the Thornton house, essentially doubling Clara's wages and ensuring that the family would not lose the income they desperately needed. Mrs. Thornton agreed reluctantly, making it clear that she considered her mother's attachment to Clara excessive and inappropriate given the Ward family's disgrace. This new arrangement meant that Clara spent several days each week living at the Thornton house and several days with her family in their temporary lodging. The separation from her family was difficult, but Clara recognized that the increased income was critical to their survival. More significantly, the arrangement created new opportunities for Clara to see Dr. Whitfield, as he continued to make regular visits to check on Mrs. Caldwell's health and to discuss the political situation in Blackstone Hollow. Their conversations during these visits became increasingly intimate, moving beyond the careful propriety they had previously maintained. They spoke more openly about their feelings and about the possibility of a future together, acknowledging that the recent events had made clear that staying in Blackstone Hollow was not a viable option for either of them. Dr. Whitfield told Clara about his plans to leave Blackstone Hollow in the coming months. His open support for the striking miners had made his position untenable, and the company had made clear that his contract would not be renewed. He had been corresponding with colleagues in other cities about potential positions, and he had received an offer to join a medical practice in Asheville, North Carolina, a city with a more progressive atmosphere and a diverse population. He told Clara that he wanted her to come with him, that he wanted to marry her and build a life together away from the rigid social hierarchies and economic injustices of the Tennessee coal country. He acknowledged all the practical difficulties and social complications this would entail, but he believed they could overcome them together. Clara's response to Dr. Whitfield's proposal was shaped by conflicting emotions and practical considerations. Part of her wanted nothing more than to leave with him, to escape the limited possibilities of her current life and to be with the man she loved. But she also felt tremendous guilt about abandoning her family when they needed her most, about leaving her mother to care for her injured father and her younger siblings without Clara's income or assistance. She thought about what people would say, how they would judge her for running away with a man above her station, how her family would be further shamed by her actions. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell, who had shown her such kindness and who would be left without a companion. These considerations paralyzed Clara, making it impossible for her to give Dr. Whitfield a definitive answer. Mrs. Caldwell, sensing Clara's internal struggle, once again called her to a private conversation. The old woman told Clara that she had lived long enough to see many people sacrifice their happiness for duty and propriety, and that she had rarely seen such sacrifices lead to anything but regret and bitterness. She told Clara that her family would survive without her, that her younger siblings would grow up, that her father would eventually recover from his injury and find work, that her mother was stronger than Clara realized. She told Clara that opportunities for genuine love were rare, especially for women in Clara's circumstances, and that choosing duty over love often meant choosing a slow death of the spirit. Mrs. Caldwell made Clara promise to think seriously about what she wanted her life to be, not what others expected it to be, and to make her decision based on her own needs and desires rather than on guilt and obligation. These conversations with Mrs. Caldwell gave Clara permission to think about her own future in ways she had not allowed herself to consider before. She began to imagine what life might be like in Asheville, a place she had never seen but that Dr. Whitfield described as a city of beauty and possibility. She imagined being married to him, having a home of her own, perhaps continuing her education, participating in a world larger than Blackstone Hollow. These imaginings filled her with excitement and hope, emotions that competed with her guilt and her sense of responsibility to her family. She realized that she was being offered a choice that few women in her circumstances ever received, a choice between security and passion, between duty and desire, between living according to others' expectations and living according to her own values. In early September, Clara made her decision. She told Dr. Whitfield that she would go with him to Asheville, that she wanted to be his wife and to build a life together. She made this decision knowing that it would bring consequences and judgment, but believing that living a life of authenticity and love was worth the price. Dr. Whitfield received her decision with joy and relief, pulling her into an embrace that was their first physical expression of the love they had restrained for so many months. They made plans to leave Blackstone Hollow in October, after Dr. Whitfield finished his obligations to his current patients and made arrangements for another physician to take over his practice. They would travel to Asheville, marry there, and begin their new life together. Clara faced the difficult task of telling her family about her decision. She chose to speak first with her mother, knowing that Margaret Ward would be hurt but hoping that her mother might understand. The conversation took place one evening when they were alone in the small kitchen of the house where the family was staying. Clara explained that she had fallen in love with Dr. Whitfield, that he had asked her to marry him and move to Asheville, and that she had decided to accept his proposal. Margaret Ward's initial response was shock and dismay. She questioned whether Dr. Whitfield's intentions were honorable, whether Clara fully understood what she was giving up, whether Clara had thought about how this decision would affect her family. Clara assured her mother that Dr. Whitfield intended to marry her properly, that she understood the implications of her choice, and that she would send money to help support the family once she was established in Asheville. Margaret Ward eventually moved beyond her initial shock to a more nuanced response. She told Clara that she had suspected for some time that Clara and Dr. Whitfield had developed feelings for each other, and that she had worried about where those feelings might lead. She expressed concern about the social obstacles Clara would face as the wife of a physician when she came from such different circumstances, about whether Clara would be accepted in Dr. Whitfield's world, about whether the love they felt now would survive the pressures they would encounter. But she also told Clara that she recognized the intelligence and moral character that had attracted Dr. Whitfield to Clara, and that perhaps Clara deserved a chance at happiness even if it came at a cost. She made Clara promise to marry Dr. Whitfield before leaving Blackstone Hollow, to maintain some degree of propriety and respectability, and Clara agreed, telling her father was more difficult. Thomas Ward was a man of strong principles who valued honor and respectability, and Clara feared his judgment. When she told him about her plans to marry Dr. Whitfield and move to Asheville, Thomas Ward was initially silent, his face reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. Eventually, he spoke, telling Clara that he was surprised but perhaps should not have been, given the attention Dr. Whitfield had paid to their family and to Clara specifically. He questioned whether Clara understood what she was getting into, whether Dr. Whitfield understood what he was getting into, and whether they had fully considered the difficulties they would face. Clara told her father that she and Dr. Whitfield loved each other and believed that love was strong enough to overcome obstacles. Thomas Ward looked at his daughter for a long moment and then told her that he hoped she was right, that he wanted her to be happy, but that he feared she might be underestimating how cruel the world could be to people who violated its expectations. The news of Clara's engagement to Dr. Whitfield spread quickly through Blackstone Hollow and the surrounding area, provoking exactly the kind of response that Clara had anticipated and dreaded. The reaction divided largely along class lines, with the mining families generally viewing the match with approval, seeing it as a victory for one of their own and evidence that education and character could overcome social barriers. The more privileged residents of Blackstone Hollow, however, viewed the engagement with scandal and disapproval, seeing it as evidence of Dr. Whitfield's poor judgment and questionable morals. and as proof that Clara had been scheming to elevate herself above her station. Mrs. Thornton was particularly vocal in her criticism, telling anyone who would listen that she had always suspected there was something inappropriate about Dr. Whitfield's frequent visits to check on her mother, and that Clara had clearly used her position in the household to pursue a man far above her proper sphere. Mrs. Caldwell remained Clara's strongest defender within the Thornton household, telling her daughter that Clara and Dr. Whitfield were both intelligent, moral people who had every right to marry if they chose, and that the community's narrow-minded disapproval reflected poorly on the community rather than on the couple. Mrs. Caldwell told Clara that she was happy for her and that she believed Clara would make Dr. Whitfield a good wife. She gave Clara a beautiful cameo brooch that had belonged to her own mother, telling Clara to wear it on her wedding day as something old and something borrowed. Mrs. Caldwell's support meant more to Clara than she could express, providing validation and encouragement at a time when she was facing harsh judgment from many quarters. Dr. Whitfield and Clara were married on a cool October morning in a simple ceremony at the Methodist Church in Blackstone Hollow. Reverend Thompson, who had known Clara since she was a child and who respected Dr. Whitfield's service to the mining families, agreed to perform the ceremony despite pressure from some church members to refuse. The ceremony was attended by Clara's family, several of the mining families who had been grateful for Dr. Whitfield's care, and Mrs. Caldwell, who insisted on attending despite her frail health. Mrs. Thornton refused to attend, making her disapproval clear, but sent a brief note of good wishes that Clara suspected was written more out of obligation than genuine sentiment. Clara wore her best dress, which her mother had carefully altered and decorated, and Mrs. Caldwell's cameo brooch at her throat. Dr. Whitfield wore his best suit and looked at Clara with an expression of love and commitment that made her feel that whatever challenges they faced in the future, they would face them together. The wedding was followed by a modest reception at the house where Clara's family was staying, with food prepared by Margaret Ward and several of the mining family's wives. The atmosphere was bittersweet, marked by happiness for the couple but also by the knowledge that Clara would be leaving soon and that her family's situation remained precarious. Thomas Ward, still recovering from his injury, spoke briefly to express his hopes for Clara's happiness and his gratitude to Dr. Whitfield for treating Clara with respect and honor. Dr. Whitfield responded by thanking the Ward family for raising such a remarkable daughter and by promising to care for Clara and to treat her with the love she deserved. Clara hugged her mother and siblings, crying at the thought of leaving them, promising to write frequently and to send money to help with their expenses. 3 days after the wedding, Clara and Dr. Whitfield left Blackstone Hollow for Asheville. They traveled by train, a journey that took most of a day, and Clara watched the Tennessee mountains pass by the window with mixed emotions. She felt sadness at leaving her family and the only place she had ever known, but also excitement at the prospect of starting a new life in a place where she and her husband would not be defined by the rigid social hierarchies of a coal mining town. Dr. Whitfield held her hand as they traveled, pointing out landmarks and telling her about Asheville, trying to ease her transition to an unknown future. Clara felt both frightened and exhilarated, aware that she had made a choice that would determine the course of her entire life. Asheville in October of 1914 was a city of contradictions, a place where wealthy tourists from the north came to escape the winter cold and enjoy the mild mountain climate, while local residents struggled with poverty and limited economic opportunities. The city was growing rapidly, with new buildings under construction and automobiles beginning to appear on streets that had previously known only horses and wagons. Dr. Whitfield had secured a position with an established medical practice that served both wealthy patients and working-class families, a position that would provide a comfortable income and the opportunity to practice medicine according to his principles. He had rented a small house on the outskirts of the city, a modest but respectable home with indoor plumbing and electric lights, luxuries that Clara had never experienced in Blackstone Hollow. Clara's first months in Asheville were a period of adjustment and discovery. She marveled at the city's size, at the variety of shops and businesses, at the public library with its thousands of books available for borrowing, at the churches and schools and parks that suggested a level of civic organization she had never witnessed. She attended concerts and lectures with her husband, experiences that opened her mind to new ideas and possibilities. She began to dress differently, adopting the styles she observed in Asheville's middle-class neighborhoods, trying to fit into her new social environment. She studied etiquette and social customs, determined to conduct herself in ways that would not embarrass her husband or reflect poorly on his professional standing. Despite these efforts, Clara quickly discovered that her background and the circumstances of her marriage had followed her to Asheville. The medical practice where Dr. Whitfield worked was led by two established physicians who welcomed Dr. Whitfield's skills and dedication but viewed his marriage to Clara with barely concealed disapproval. The doctors' wives, who were active in Asheville's social circles, initially attempted to include Clara in their activities out of obligation to their husband's professional relationship with Dr. Whitfield. However, these efforts were marked by condescension and subtle hostility. The women would ask Clara questions about her background that seemed designed to highlight her humble origins, or they would discuss topics like European travel and expensive fashions that Clara knew nothing about, or they would use vocabulary and cultural references that assumed educational and social experiences Clara had never had. Clara bore these slights with as much grace as she could manage, trying to learn from her mistakes and to improve her social skills. But the constant sense of being judged and found wanting took a psychological toll. She began to feel increasingly isolated, unable to fit comfortably into her husband's social world but also unable to return to the world she had left behind. She missed her family desperately, worried constantly about their welfare, and felt guilty about having left them to pursue her own happiness. She wrote long letters to her mother, sending what money she could spare, but the separation remained painful. The letters she received from home told of continued struggles, of her father's difficulty finding stable employment, of her younger siblings' needs that could not always be met. Each letter reinforced Clara's guilt and her sense that she had abandoned her family in their time of greatest need. Dr. Whitfield was aware of Clara's difficulties and tried to help her adjust to their new life. He assured her that she was not responsible for others' snobbery and prejudice, that their marriage was based on love and mutual respect, and that over time people would accept her once they came to know her. He encouraged her to continue her education by reading extensively and by attending public lectures. He introduced her to patients from working-class backgrounds who reminded Clara of the people she had known in Blackstone Hollow, people who treated her with warmth and acceptance. He remained devoted to Clara, making it clear through his words and actions that he considered their marriage a blessing and that he had no regrets about his choice to marry her. The outbreak of World War I in Europe in August of 1914 had seemed like a distant event when Clara and Dr. Whitfield first arrived in Asheville, but by early 1915 the war began to affect American life in various ways. Dr. Whitfield followed news of the war with great interest and growing concern, reading newspaper accounts of the unprecedented casualties and the new forms of mechanized warfare that were devastating entire generations of young men. He began to consider whether he had an obligation to serve as a military physician if the United States entered the war, a possibility that seemed increasingly likely as German submarine attacks on civilian ships created public outrage. Clara listened to his discussions of these matters with growing dread, terrified at the thought of losing him after having only recently gained the happiness of their marriage. In April of 1915, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with complex emotions: joy at the prospect of having a child with the man she loved, anxiety about her ability to be a good mother, and concern about how a child would affect their already complicated social position. Dr. Whitfield received the news with unqualified happiness, telling Clara that a child would complete their family and provide new meaning to their lives. Clara's pregnancy became apparent to others over the following months, and she encountered reactions that ranged from genuine congratulations to barely concealed judgment about the timing of the pregnancy relative to her marriage. Clara found these judgments particularly painful, as she and Dr. Whitfield had married properly and their child had been conceived within marriage, but she was learning that some people would always find ways to criticize those they considered beneath their station. Margaret Ward came to Asheville in November to help Clara prepare for the birth and to provide support during and after the delivery. The reunion between mother and daughter was emotional and bittersweet. Margaret Ward was thin and worn, aged beyond her years by the hardships of the past 2 years, but she was overjoyed to see Clara and to learn that she would become a grandmother. Margaret stayed with Clara and Dr. Whitfield for 2 months, during which time she helped Clara prepare a nursery and taught her about childbirth and infant care. Margaret also observed Clara's new life and the challenges she faced in Asheville. She could see that despite the material comforts Clara now enjoyed, her daughter was struggling with social isolation and with the psychological burden of not fully belonging to her new world while being permanently separated from her old one. Margaret tried to reassure Clara that she had made the right choice, that her family was proud of her, and that the difficulties she currently faced would diminish over time. Clara's daughter was born in January of 1916, a healthy baby girl whom they named Sarah Elizabeth after Mrs. Caldwell and Clara's middle name. The birth was difficult, and Clara suffered complications that left her weak for several weeks afterward. Dr. Whitfield cared for Clara and the baby with devotion and skill, and Margaret Ward remained in Asheville longer than she had planned to help during Clara's recovery. The experience of becoming a mother transformed Clara in ways she had not anticipated. The all-consuming demands of caring for an infant left little time for brooding about social acceptance or past choices. Clara discovered reserves of strength and capability she had not known she possessed. She loved her daughter with an intensity that both frightened and awed her, and she was determined that Sarah would have opportunities and advantages that had been denied to Clara herself. Margaret Ward returned to her family in Tennessee in March, leaving Clara to manage motherhood while Dr. Whitfield continued his medical practice. Clara found the isolation of early motherhood challenging, lacking the network of female relatives and neighbors who typically supported new mothers in communities like Blackstone Hollow. The doctors' wives made perfunctory visits to see the baby but did not offer the kind of practical help and companionship that Clara craved. Clara began seeking out other young mothers in working-class neighborhoods, women who reminded her of the women she had known in her childhood, and she found among them the acceptance and support that was missing in her husband's professional circle. These friendships sustained Clara during the difficult months of early motherhood and helped her create a social world that felt authentic and comfortable. In May of 1916, news reached Clara that Mrs. Caldwell had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Clara mourned the loss of a woman who had shown her kindness when few others had, who had encouraged her education and her dreams, and who had supported her marriage to Dr. Whitfield when others had condemned it. Mrs. Caldwell had left Clara a small bequest in her will, a sum of money that Clara could use for her daughter's future education or for helping her family. The gesture moved Clara deeply, representing a final affirmation from someone who had believed in her worth and potential. Clara used part of the money to visit her family in Tennessee, bringing baby Sarah to meet her grandfather Thomas Ward before his health deteriorated further. The visit was emotional and difficult, as Clara could see how much her family had struggled in her absence and how guilty she felt about her own relative comfort. The United States entered World War I in April of 1917, and Dr. Whitfield, after much internal struggle, decided to volunteer as a military physician. He told Clara that he felt obligated to serve, that his medical skills were needed to save lives on the battlefield, and that he could not in good conscience remain safely in Asheville while other men faced death and suffering in France. Clara understood his reasoning and respected his sense of duty, but she was devastated by the prospect of losing him. They had been married for less than 3 years, their daughter was barely a year old, and now he would be going to a war where physicians and soldiers alike were dying in unprecedented numbers. Dr. Whitfield arranged for Clara to receive his military pay and for colleagues to check on her welfare during his absence, and he left for military training in June of 1917. The months of Dr. Whitfield's absence were the most difficult period of Clara's life since leaving Blackstone Hollow. She cared for Sarah alone, managed the household, and waited anxiously for letters that arrived irregularly and that were heavily censored to remove any information that might compromise military operations. The letters that did arrive told her little about what Dr. Whitfield was experiencing but revealed through their tone that the war was more terrible than anyone had imagined. Clara lived in constant fear that she would receive a telegram informing her of her husband's death, a fear that was reinforced each time she heard of other local men who had been killed in France. She drew strength from her daughter and from her growing network of friends among working-class mothers in Asheville, women who were experiencing similar fears for husbands and sons fighting in the war. During this period of separation and uncertainty, Clara received devastating news from Tennessee. Her father Thomas Ward had died from complications of pneumonia, his lungs weakened by years of breathing coal dust in the mines and by the lingering effects of his injury. Clara had not been able to see her father before his death, and she was consumed by guilt about having been absent during his final illness. She traveled to Tennessee for the funeral, bringing Sarah with her, and she found her family in dire circumstances. Her mother was working as a domestic servant to support Clara's younger siblings, who were struggling in school and showed signs of malnourishment. Clara used Mrs. Caldwell's bequest to help her family, paying off debts and providing money for immediate needs, but she knew that her help was temporary and that her family would continue to struggle after she returned to Asheville. The war ended in November of 1918 with an armistice that brought relief and celebration throughout the United States. Dr. Whitfield returned to Asheville in January of 1919, changed by his experiences in France in ways that he found difficult to articulate. He had witnessed death and suffering on a scale that had shaken his faith in human progress and civilization. He suffered from nightmares and periods of deep melancholy that Clara did not know how to address. He threw himself back into his medical practice with renewed intensity, as if treating patients in Asheville could somehow compensate for the lives he had been unable to save in France. Clara welcomed him home with profound relief and gratitude, but she also recognized that the war had created a new distance between them, an experience he had endured that she could not fully understand or share. In the years that followed, Clara and Dr. Whitfield rebuilt their life together, gradually recovering the intimacy and partnership that had characterized their early marriage. They had a second child, a son whom they named Thomas after Clara's father, and Clara devoted herself to raising her children and supporting her husband's medical practice. Dr. Whitfield's war service had enhanced his reputation in Asheville, and over time the social barriers that had initially excluded Clara began to erode as people came to know her as Dr. Whitfield's capable and devoted wife rather than as a coal miner's daughter who had married above her station. Clara never fully felt that she belonged to Asheville's professional class, but she learned to navigate its expectations and to find satisfaction in the life she had built. Clara maintained contact with her family in Tennessee, sending money when she could and visiting periodically with her children. Her mother, Margaret Ward, lived to see her grandchildren grow up, though she never fully recovered from the hardships of her life in the coal country. Clara's siblings followed various paths, some remaining in Tennessee and others migrating to cities in search of better opportunities. Clara helped where she could, using the financial stability of her marriage to provide educational opportunities for her younger siblings that had been denied to her. She remained haunted by guilt about having left her family, wondering whether she could have done more to help them if she had stayed in Tennessee, but she also recognized that marrying Dr. Whitfield had given her the resources to help her family in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. As Clara entered middle age, she began to reflect more deeply on the choices she had made and the price she had paid for them. She had achieved material security and had married a man who loved and respected her, but she had also experienced profound losses and had lived with the constant awareness of not fully belonging to either the world she had left or the world she had entered. She had gained education and opportunities, but she had lost the close community bonds and the cultural continuity that had defined her early life. Her children, growing up in Asheville with educational advantages and social acceptance that Clara had never known, belonged to a world that was foreign to their maternal grandparents, creating a generational divide that Clara found both satisfying and melancholy. In 1924, when Clara was 31 years old, she learned that Blackstone Hollow had been largely abandoned after the coal seam was exhausted and the company closed the mine. The cabins where Clara and hundreds of other families had lived were empty and decaying, reclaimed by the forest that had been there before the coal company arrived. The story of the community's struggles, the strike of 1914, the families that had been evicted and displaced, the miners who had died from lung disease and accidents, all of this history was fading from memory, preserved only in the recollections of those who had lived it. Clara realized that her own story, the forbidden love that had allowed her to escape the coal country and build a different life, would never be recorded in any history book, would never be seen as significant enough to preserve or study. It was a story too small and too common, the story of a working-class woman who had loved a professional man and had suffered consequences and judgment for violating social boundaries that everyone understood but no one explicitly acknowledged. Dr. Whitfield died unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1932, leaving Clara a widow at 39 with 2 teenage children. His death devastated Clara, who had lost not only her husband but also her primary connection to Asheville's professional community and her main source of financial security. She discovered that despite having been married to Dr. Whitfield for 18 years, she was still viewed by many people primarily as someone who had come from poor circumstances and had benefited from an advantageous marriage. The doctors who had been Dr. Whitfield's colleagues offered condolences but little practical support. Clara found herself having to manage her family's finances carefully, relying on Dr. Whitfield's life insurance and the small savings they had accumulated. She took in sewing to supplement her income, a return to the kind of manual labor she had done as a young woman in Blackstone Hollow, though now she worked in her own home rather than in a coal company town.